Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive into history's most unpleasant realities. Tonight, we're trading Roman discipline for medieval, well, let's call it the complete absence of discipline when it came to personal hygiene. We're talking about what it was actually like to be a medieval peasant trying to stay clean in a world where soap was a luxury and a bath was basically a once-in-a-lifetime event. So grab your favorite beverage, maybe light a scented candle to prepare yourself for what's coming, and let's settle in together. If you enjoy these historical reality checks, go ahead and hit that like button, and let me know in the comments what medieval hygiene fact you think will horrify you the most. Now, you probably think you could handle medieval life. You've camped before, you've gone a few days without showering, maybe you've even used an outhouse.
Cute.
That's like saying you're ready to climb Everest, because you once walked up a particularly steep hill. Medieval peasant hygiene wasn't just about being a little dirty, it was a masterclass in human endurance that would make a Roman legionnaire weep into his precisely maintained armor. So dim those lights, get comfortable, and prepare to feel very, very grateful for modern plumbing. Picture this: you wake up in medieval Europe, and the first thing that hits you isn't the rooster crowing or the church bells ringing, it's the smell. Not just any smell, mind you, but a complex bouquet of human funk, animal waste, rotting vegetables, and whatever died in the corner of your hovel 3 weeks ago that you've been too busy not dying of plague to remove. Welcome to medieval hygiene, where soap was a luxury item and a bath was an annual event if you were lucky. Your average medieval peasant didn't wake up wondering about their skincare routine or whether their breath was minty fresh. They woke up wondering if they'd survive another day without being trampled by a horse, executed for looking at a nobleman funny, or succumbing to one of the 17 different diseases currently throwing a party in their intestines. Personal hygiene wasn't a priority when personal survival was a full-time job that didn't pay well and came with terrible benefits. Let's start with the obvious question: when did medieval people bathe? The short answer is occasionally. The long answer is complicated, involving everything from religious beliefs to economic realities to the fact that heating water was about as convenient as organizing a royal wedding. Most peasants bathed when they absolutely had to, which was roughly never, unless you count standing in the rain or falling into a river while fleeing from bandits. That the wealthy had bathhouses, sure, but if you were a peasant, your bathroom was wherever you happened to be standing when nature called urgently enough. Your bathtub was the local stream, assuming it wasn't frozen, contaminated with the runoff from the tanner's workshop, or currently occupied by someone else's livestock. Privacy was a concept reserved for nobles and hermits chose to live alone specifically to avoid dealing with other people's hygiene habits. Now, about that water situation. Clean water was harder to find than an honest tax collector. Most water sources were contaminated with everything you can imagine and several things you'd rather not. The village well, if there was one, was often downhill from the cemetery and the latrine, because medieval urban planning was apparently designed by someone with a grudge against the living. Rivers were open sewers. Streams were convenient dumping grounds for whatever needed dumping, which was everything. So when peasants did attempt to clean themselves, they used whatever water was available, which was usually the same water they cooked with, washed clothes in, and occasionally used to put out fires. Water was precious, and wasting it on something as frivolous as personal cleanliness was considered almost sinful. After all, God made you dirty for a reason, and who were you to argue with divine will? The tools of medieval hygiene were about as sophisticated as you'd expect from an era where the height of medical technology was drilling holes in people's heads to let the evil spirits out. Soap existed, but it was made from animal fat and ash, which sounds more like a recipe for a chemical burn than a cleansing agent. It was expensive, hard to make, and had the consistency and appeal of chunky vomit. Most people made do with whatever was handy sand for scrubbing, urine for its supposed antiseptic properties, and pure determination. Actually, let's talk about urine for a moment, because medieval people had some fascinating ideas about bodily fluids. They believed urine could cure everything from toothaches to baldness, and they weren't shy about using it. Morning urine was considered the most potent, So people would collect their first piss of the day like it was liquid gold. They used it to wash their faces, believing it would give them a healthy glow. Spoiler alert, it didn't. What it gave them was the distinctive aroma of someone who had recently bathed in their own waste. Dental hygiene was its own special nightmare. Toothbrushes didn't exist, so people used whatever was handy to clean their teeth: twigs, rags, their fingernails, or nothing at all. Toothpaste was a mixture of crushed bones, oyster shells, and hope. Some people believed that cleaning your teeth too often would make them fall out, which is ironic considering that not cleaning them had the same result, just with more pain and infection. The wealthy might have had access to imported spices and herbs for dental care, but peasants made do with local alternatives. Mint, if they could find it. Salt, if they could afford it. More often, they just accepted that their teeth would rot and fall out by the time they hit 30, assuming they lived that long. Bad breath was so common that it wasn't even considered particularly offensive. Everyone's breath smelled like a combination of decay, garlic, and existential despair. Hair care was another adventure in medieval creativity. Shampoo wasn't a thing, obviously, so people washed their hair with whatever they used for everything else. Soap made from ash and animal fat, if they were lucky, or just water and vigorous scrubbing if they weren't. Lice were so common that they were practically considered pets. Everyone had them. Rich people, poor people, clergy. Nobles' lice were the great equalizer, the one thing that united all social classes in itchy misery. Getting rid of lice was a full-time job that nobody wanted, but everyone needed. People tried everything. Special combs made of bone or wood, various herbal concoctions that smelled worse than the lice, and sometimes just shaving off all their hair and starting over. Some believed that lice were a sign of health, reasoning that parasites would only live on vigorous, healthy hosts. This was, of course, complete nonsense. But it made people feel better about their infestations. Women had the additional challenge of dealing with their hair, while wearing head coverings most of the time. Married women were expected to cover their hair in public, which meant their hair spent most of its time trapped under layers of fabric, creating the perfect environment for all sorts of microscopic life forms to flourish. Unmarried women could wear their hair loose, but they still had to deal with the same basic problems: no proper cleaning products, no effective treatments for infestations, and no real understanding of what caused these problems in the first place. Let's discuss clothing, because medieval garments were basically wearable ecosystems. Most people owned 1 or 2 sets of clothes, which they wore until they literally fell apart. Washing clothes was an occasional event, partly because soap was expensive and partly because the process was so labor-intensive that it took an entire day and left you exhausted. Clothes were made of wool or linen, materials that required specific care and couldn't just be tossed into a washing machine with some detergent. The process of washing clothes started with collecting enough water, which meant multiple trips to the nearest source with heavy buckets. Then you had to heat the water, which required fuel that cost money and time to gather. You needed soap or some substitute cleaning agent, which might be ash, water if you couldn't afford actual soap. Then came the actual washing, pounding the clothes with sticks, scrubbing them against rocks, rinsing them multiple times, and finally hanging them to dry, assuming the weather cooperated. Most people simply wore their clothes until they were too disgusting to bear, then washed them once and wore them again until the next unbearable threshold was reached. This meant that everyone walked around in various states of filthiness, with clothing that had absorbed months of sweat, food stains, and whatever else life had thrown at them. The smell must have been incredible in the worst possible way. Undergarments, when they existed at all, were even worse. Most people wore a simple linen shirt under their outer clothing, and this shirt served as both underwear and undershirt. It was supposed to absorb sweat and protect the outer garments, but since it was washed even less frequently than the outer clothes, it became a concentrated essence of human funk. Some people wore the same linen shirt for weeks or months without washing it, until it could probably walk around on its own. The wealthy might have owned multiple linen shirts and could afford to wash them more frequently, but even they lived by standards that would horrify a modern person. A nobleman who changed his linen shirt once a week was considered fastidious. A peasant who owned more than one shirt was either incredibly lucky or had stolen it from someone else. Women's clothing presented additional challenges. Long dresses dragged through mud, animal waste, and whatever else covered the ground. The hems of women's dresses were constantly filthy, and there was no practical way to keep them clean. Women who worked in fields, kitchens, or anywhere else would end up with their clothing saturated with the smells and stains of their work. A woman who worked in a kitchen would smell permanently of smoke, grease, and whatever food was currently rotting in the corners. Now, let's talk about what passed for deodorant in medieval times. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. People understood that they smelled bad, but their solutions were more creative than effective. They used various herbs and flowers, tucking them into their clothing or rubbing them on their skin. Lavender, rosemary, and other aromatic plants were popular choices, but they were fighting a losing battle against the concentrated power of unwashed human bodies. Some people believed that strong smells could overpower bad smells, so they would use particularly pungent substances like garlic or onions. This didn't eliminate body odor, it just created new and more complex aromatic combinations that could clear a room just as effectively. Others tried to mask their smell with whatever perfumes they could afford or make, usually flower waters or herb-infused oils that provided temporary relief at best. The concept of antiperspirant didn't exist because people didn't really understand what caused body odor in the first place. They knew that sweating was involved somehow, but they thought it was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors or divine judgment rather than bacteria feeding on sweat. Their solutions focused on masking the symptoms rather than addressing the cause, which meant that everyone just smelled differently terrible rather than actually clean. Medieval people also had some interesting theories about when and why to wash different parts of their bodies. Hands were washed relatively frequently because they were obviously dirty after work, eating, or handling animals. Faces were washed somewhat regularly, especially by women who cared about their appearance. But the idea of washing your entire body on a regular basis was foreign and potentially dangerous. Many people believed that washing too frequently would weaken their constitution or make them more susceptible to disease. They thought that a layer of dirt and grime actually provided protection against the elements and helped maintain the body's natural balance. Some religious authorities taught that excessive cleanliness was a sign of vanity and pride, deadly sins that could endanger your eternal soul. Better to be dirty and humble than clean and damned. The church's attitude toward bathing was complicated and contradictory. Some religious authorities promoted cleanliness as a virtue, citing biblical passages about spiritual and physical purity. Others viewed bathing with suspicion, especially communal bathing, which they associated with Roman decadence and sexual immorality. Monks and nuns often had rules about bathing. Some orders required regular washing, while others forbade it except in cases of illness. Public bathhouses existed in some medieval towns, and they were popular when they were available. These bathhouses were social centers where people could not only get clean but also conduct business, gossip, and socialize. However, they were also breeding grounds for disease and, according to church authorities, sin. Bathhouses were often associated with prostitution and moral corruption, which led to periodic crackdowns and closures. The bathhouses that remained open were expensive enough that most peasants couldn't afford to use them regularly. A visit to the bathhouse was a special occasion, something you might do once or twice a year if you were particularly prosperous, or if someone else was paying. For most people, the local stream or river was the only bathing option available, and even that was seasonal. Nobody was taking voluntary baths in frozen rivers during winter. Personal hygiene wasn't just about cleanliness, it was also about social status and survival. Being too clean could mark you as vain or above your station, while being too dirty could make you unemployable or unmarriageable. There was a narrow range of acceptable filthiness that varied depending on your social class, occupation, and local customs. A peasant who worked in the fields was expected to be dirty, but they still needed to maintain some minimal standards if they wanted to be accepted in their community. The tools available for personal hygiene were primitive and often dangerous. Razors were hand, forged pieces of metal that required constant sharpening and could easily cause serious cuts or infections. Most men let their beards grow rather than risk regular shaving, and when they did shave, it was a significant event that might require the assistance of someone else with steadier hands and better eyesight. Women had their own challenges with personal grooming. Removing body hair was fashionable in some circles, but the methods available were painful and potentially harmful. Some women used early forms of tweezers to pluck unwanted hair, a process that was time-consuming and likely to cause infections. Others used primitive razors or sharp knives, risking cuts and scarring. Many simply accepted that body hair was natural and unavoidable. Nail care was another area where medieval people had to make do with inadequate tools. Fingernails and toenails were cut with knives or small scissors when available, but many people simply bit their nails or let them grow until they broke off naturally. Long nails were sometimes seen as a sign of wealth and leisure. If your nails were long, it meant you didn't do manual labor, but they were also impractical and unsanitary. The medical understanding of hygiene was almost completely wrong, which led to practices that were either useless or actively harmful. Medieval physicians believed that disease was caused by bad air or miasma, so they focused on avoiding foul smells rather than actually cleaning their bodies or environments. They thought that certain scents could prevent illness, leading to the use of pomanders and herb sachets that did nothing to improve actual hygiene. Bloodletting was considered a form of hygiene, a way to purify the body by removing excess or corrupted blood. Patients would be blood regularly as a preventive measure, weakening their immune systems and making them more susceptible to the very diseases the treatment was supposed to prevent. Urine analysis was used to diagnose everything from pregnancy to personality disorders, with physicians examining color, clarity, and smell to determine what was wrong with their patients. The lack of understanding about germs and disease transmission meant that people had no idea how infections spread or how to prevent them. They might avoid someone who was obviously sick, but they didn't understand that disease could be spread through contaminated water, unwashed hands, or infected clothing. This ignorance led to repeated epidemics that could have been prevented or limited with basic hygiene practices. Food hygiene was particularly problematic because people didn't understand the connection between spoiled food and illness. They ate meat that had been hanging for weeks without refrigeration, consumed dairy products that had gone sour, and used cooking utensils that were never properly cleaned. Food poisoning was so common that people just accepted stomach problems as a normal part of life. Water storage was another health hazard that people didn't recognize. Water was kept in containers that were rarely cleaned thoroughly, allowing bacteria and parasites to multiply. People would drink water that had been sitting in dirty containers for days or weeks, not understanding why they frequently suffered from digestive problems. Beer and wine were often safer than water because the alcohol killed some of the harmful microorganisms, but even fermented drinks could become contaminated if stored improperly. The disposal of human waste was handled in ways that seem horrifying by modern standards. Most people used outdoor latrines when they were available, but these were often just holes in the ground that filled up over time and overflowed during heavy rains. In cities, people might empty chamber pots directly into the streets or into nearby rivers, creating open sewers that bred disease and attracted vermin. Chamber pots were used for nighttime convenience, but they were emptied irregularly and cleaned even less frequently. Many households owned only one chamber pot, which was shared by everyone in the family. The contents might sit for days before being disposed of, creating a concentrated source of contamination right in the living space. Some people simply threw the contents out their windows, leading to city ordinances requiring people to shout warnings before emptying chamber pots into the streets. The connection between waste disposal and disease wasn't understood, so people saw no problem with dumping human and animal waste near water sources or food storage areas. Wells were often contaminated with runoff from latrines, graveyards, and animal pens, but people continued to drink the water because they had no alternatives and didn't realize it was making them sick. Animal hygiene was even worse than human hygiene. If such a thing was possible, livestock lived in close proximity to people, often sharing the same buildings during cold weather. Cows, pigs, chickens, and other animals were kept in conditions that would horrify modern farmers, with no understanding of how animal waste and parasites could affect human health. Pigs were particularly problematic because they ate anything and everything, including human waste when it was available. They wallowed in mud and filth, picking up parasites and diseases that could be transmitted to humans. People ate pork without understanding the risks, and trichinosis was common among those who could afford meat regularly. Chickens and other birds were kept in coops that were cleaned infrequently, if at all. The accumulation of bird droppings created ideal conditions for disease, carrying insects and parasites. People collected eggs from these filthy coops and ate them without washing them, sometimes consuming eggs that were already contaminated with bacteria. Cats and dogs lived alongside humans but received no veterinary care and were often infested with fleas, ticks, and worms. These pets served as vectors for disease transmission, carrying parasites from animals to humans and spreading infections throughout households. People loved their animals but had no understanding of how to keep them healthy or prevent them from spreading disease. The seasonal nature of medieval life meant that hygiene practices varied dramatically throughout the year. Summer brought opportunities for bathing in streams and rivers, but it also brought increased pest problems and faster food spoilage. Winter made bathing nearly impossible, but reduced some pest populations and helped preserve food through freezing temperatures. Spring cleaning was a real necessity, not just a tradition. After months of being cooped up indoors with inadequate ventilation, medieval homes accumulated incredible amounts of dirt, soot, and organic waste. When weather permitted, people would air out their homes, clean what they could, and try to restore some semblance of habitability to their living spaces. Harvest time brought its own hygiene challenges. People working long hours in fields would go days without proper washing, sleeping in their work clothes and eating meals with dirty hands. Food preservation during harvest season was critical, but the methods available were primitive and often failed, leading to spoilage and waste that attracted insects and vermin. The social aspects of medieval hygiene were complicated by class distinctions and cultural expectations. Nobles were expected to maintain higher standards of cleanliness than peasants, but higher was still pretty low by modern standards. A noble might change their linen shirt twice a week and bathe once a month, which would have been considered exemplary hygiene for the time. Marriage contracts sometimes included provisions about hygiene, with brides or grooms specifying that their spouse should maintain certain standards of cleanliness. These standards were usually minimal, perhaps requiring that the spouse wash their hands before meals or change their clothes occasionally, but they show that people recognized hygiene as a factor in domestic happiness. Social gatherings were aromatic affairs where dozens of unwashed bodies would crowd together in poorly ventilated spaces. Churches, markets, and festivals must have been overwhelming sensory experiences, with the combined smells of sweat, dirty clothes, bad breath, and various attempts at masking these odors with herbs and flowers. People developed tolerance for these conditions out of necessity, but visitors from cleaner cultures often commented on the overwhelming stench of medieval European cities. Professional hygiene varied widely depending on the occupation. Blacksmiths worked in conditions that were hot, sooty, and smoky, leaving them perpetually grimy. Tanners worked with animal hides and various chemicals that created persistent, nose-eating odors that could never be completely washed away. Butchers dealt with blood and animal parts that stained their clothes and hands. Some professions actually required better hygiene than others. Bakers needed relatively clean hands to handle food, and cooks in wealthy households might be required to maintain higher standards than the general population. Barbers, who also served as surgeons and dentists, were expected to keep their tools clean, though their understanding of clean was limited by the medical knowledge of the time. Merchants who travelled between cities were often cleaner than the general population because they could afford better accommodations and had access to bathhouses in different towns. However, long periods of travel meant they often went weeks between proper washing opportunities, and their clothes would absorb the dust and grime of medieval roads. Religious practices around hygiene were inconsistent and often contradictory. Some Christian traditions emphasized physical cleanliness as a reflection of spiritual purity, encouraging regular washing and clean clothing. Other traditions viewed excessive attention to physical appearance as vanity and pride, promoting deliberate neglect of personal hygiene as a form of spiritual discipline. Pilgrims faced particular hygiene challenges during their journeys. They might walk for weeks or months to reach their destinations, sleeping outdoors or in crowded hostels with minimal washing facilities. Pilgrim badges and relics were often dirty and carried diseases between different regions, but they were considered too sacred to clean properly. Monks and nuns followed rules that varied dramatically between different orders and time periods. Some monastic rules required daily washing of hands and faces, weekly washing of feet, and regular changing of clothes. Others forbade bathing except in cases of serious illness, viewing physical discomfort as a form of spiritual discipline that brought them closer to God. The seasonal religious calendar affected hygiene practices, with some periods requiring fasting and others encouraging feasting. Lent was a time when people might deliberately neglect their appearance as a form of penance, while Easter brought opportunities for ritual cleansing and new clothes for those who could afford them. Medical hygiene was primitive and often counterproductive. Physicians rarely washed their hands between patients, and surgical instruments were cleaned inadequately, if at all. Bandages were reused without proper washing, and wounds were treated with various substances that often caused more harm than good. Childbirth was particularly dangerous from a hygiene standpoint. Midwives had no understanding of sterile procedures, and women giving birth were attended by multiple people with unwashed hands using dirty instruments. Infant mortality was extremely high, partly due to infections that could have been prevented with basic hygiene practices. Dental surgery was performed with tools that were used for multiple purposes and rarely cleaned properly. Tooth extraction was often done with the same pliers used for other household tasks, and infections were common. People who survived dental procedures often developed serious infections that could be life-threatening. The treatment of wounds and injuries was hampered by poor hygiene practices. Battlefield medicine was particularly crude, with surgeons working in conditions that guaranteed infection. Amputations were performed with saws and knives that had been used for other purposes, and the stumps were cauterized with hot irons that had never been properly cleaned. Urban hygiene presented different challenges from rural hygiene. Cities concentrated large numbers of people in small areas with inadequate infrastructure for waste disposal and water distribution. Streets were open sewers, and the smell of cities could be detected from miles away. Urban dwellers lived in closer proximity to each other, making disease transmission more rapid and devastating. Rural peasants had access to cleaner water sources and more space for waste disposal, but they also lived in closer contact with animals and their waste. Farm work was dirty and dangerous, involving constant exposure to mud, animal droppings, and various organic materials that could cause infections or parasitic infestations. The housing conditions of medieval peasants made good hygiene nearly impossible. Most homes were single rooms shared by entire families, with dirt floors that became muddy during wet weather. There was no running water, no indoor plumbing, and often no glass in the windows. Smoke from cooking fires filled the rooms, covering everything with soot and making breathing difficult. Furniture was minimal and rarely cleaned thoroughly. Beds were often shared by multiple people and were infested with various insects and parasites. Mattresses were stuffed with straw or other organic materials that attracted pests and decomposed over time, creating ideal breeding grounds for disease-carrying organisms. Food storage in medieval homes was problematic because there was no refrigeration and limited understanding of food preservation. Meat was often stored at room temperature until it spoiled, and people ate food that would be considered inedible by modern standards. Grain was stored in containers that were not pest-proof, and mice and insects contaminated food supplies regularly. Clothing storage was equally problematic. People owned so few clothes that they often wore the same garments for weeks or months without washing them. When clothes were stored, they were kept in chests or hanging on pegs where they could be infested with moths, mice, or other pests. The lack of understanding about fabric care meant that clothes were often damaged by improper storage or cleaning attempts. The psychology of medieval hygiene is fascinating to consider. People living in these conditions developed tolerance levels that seem impossible to modern minds. They accepted body odor, dirty clothes, and contaminated food as normal parts of life. This wasn't because they didn't notice these problems. Contemporary writings show that people were aware of hygiene issues, but because they had no practical alternatives and limited understanding of the health consequences. Social pressure around hygiene was minimal because everyone lived in similar conditions. If everyone smelled bad, nobody's smell was particularly noteworthy. If everyone's clothes were dirty, clean clothes were unusual rather than expected. This created a feedback loop where poor hygiene standards were reinforced by social acceptance and practical limitations. The economic aspects of medieval hygiene were significant barriers to improvement. Soap was expensive and difficult to make. Clean water was often scarce and had to be carried by hand from distant sources. Fuel for heating water was costly and time-consuming to gather. Multiple sets of clothing were luxury items that most people couldn't afford. Even basic hygiene tools like combs, razors, and scissors were expensive and had to be maintained carefully to prevent them from breaking or becoming unusable. The labor involved in maintaining even minimal hygiene standards was enormous. Washing clothes required an entire day of work involving multiple trips to carry water, gathering fuel to heat the water, and the physical labor of scrubbing and rinsing. Bathing required similar preparation and effort. Most people were already working from dawn to dusk just to survive, and they had little time or energy left for hygiene tasks that seemed less critical than food production and shelter maintenance. Seasonal variations in hygiene were extreme. Winter made bathing nearly impossible in most regions, and people might go months without any form of full body washing. Spring brought opportunities for cleaning that had been impossible during cold weather, but also brought increased pest activity as insects and parasites emerged from winter dormancy. Summer provided the best opportunities for bathing and clothes washing, but also created conditions where food spoiled quickly and body odor was more problematic. Autumn was harvest time, when people worked long hours in dirty conditions and had little time for personal care. The technological limitations of medieval hygiene tools meant that even people who wanted to maintain better standards faced significant obstacles. Soap was harsh and could cause skin irritation or chemical burns. Razors were crude and dangerous, requiring considerable skill to use safely. Combs were often made of materials that broke easily and couldn't effectively remove lice or other parasites. Scissors were expensive and required regular maintenance to remain sharp enough to cut hair or trim nails effectively. Water quality was a constant problem that people didn't fully understand. Wells were often contaminated with runoff from latrines, animal pens, or cemeteries. Rivers and streams carried waste from upstream communities and were used for dumping garbage and sewage. Even rainwater was contaminated by the soot and debris that accumulated on roofs and in gutters. People drank this contaminated water because they had no alternatives and no understanding of how it was making them sick. The preservation of food without refrigeration or understanding of bacteria led to dietary practices that contributed to poor health and hygiene. People ate meat that had been hanging for weeks in warm weather, consumed dairy products that had soared, and used cooking methods that didn't kill harmful microorganisms. Food poisoning was so common that people accepted stomach problems as a normal part of life, not realizing that their food handling practices were the cause. Pest control was primitive and largely ineffective. People tried to keep rats and mice out of their homes and food supplies, but they had limited success. Insects were controlled primarily through seasonal changes in temperature rather than any human intervention. Fleas, lice, and other parasites were managed through occasional cleaning and the use of herbs and other substances that had limited effectiveness. The disposal of organic waste created ongoing hygiene problems. Kitchen scraps, animal waste, and human waste were often disposed of in ways that contaminated water supplies or created breeding grounds for disease, carrying insects. People understood that waste smelled bad and attracted pests, but they didn't understand the connection between waste disposal and disease transmission. Personal care during illness was particularly problematic because people didn't understand how diseases spread or how to prevent transmission. Sick people were cared for by family members who didn't take precautions against infection. Bedding and clothing used by sick people were rarely washed or disinfected properly. Multiple people might use the same chamber pot without cleaning it between uses, spreading infections throughout households. The treatment of injuries and wounds was hampered by poor understanding of infection and healing. People used various substances to treat wounds, including animal dung, urine, and herbs, often making infections worse rather than better. Bandages were reused without proper cleaning, and wounds were examined with dirty hands using contaminated instruments. Pregnancy and childbirth presented particular hygiene challenges because people didn't understand the importance of sterile conditions. Midwives attended multiple births with unwashed hands and reused instruments. Newborn infants were handled by multiple people without hand washing, and they were often clothed in garments that hadn't been properly cleaned. Infant mortality was extremely high, partly due to infections that could have been prevented with basic hygiene practices. The social dynamics of hygiene created interesting patterns of behavior and expectation. People developed elaborate rituals around hand washing before meals, not because they understood germs, but because clean hands were considered polite and showed respect for the food and other diners. However, the same people might not wash their hands after using the latrine or handling animals because they didn't understand how diseases were transmitted. Giving sometimes included hygiene, related items like combs, mirrors, or scented oils, but these were luxury items that most people couldn't afford for everyday use. When people did receive such gifts, they were often saved for special occasions rather than used regularly, limiting their practical impact on hygiene. Marriage negotiations sometimes included discussions about hygiene expectations, with families specifying that their daughter or son should maintain certain standards of cleanliness. These standards were usually minimal by modern measures, but they show that people recognized hygiene as a factor in domestic compatibility and social acceptance. The development of trade networks brought some improvement in hygiene-related goods, but these improvements were limited to people who could afford imported items. Spices, perfumes, and better quality soaps became available in some regions, but they remained expensive luxury items rather than everyday necessities. Professional specialization led to the development of some hygiene-related services. Barbers offered shaving and hair cutting services, though their tools and techniques were crude by modern standards. Bathhouse operators provided bathing facilities in some towns, though these were often associated with moral corruption and were frequently closed by religious or civil authorities. The influence of Islamic and Byzantine cultures introduced some improved hygiene practices to Western Europe through trade and military contact. However, these influences were often limited to wealthy elites who could afford to adopt foreign customs and purchase imported goods. Climate variations had significant impacts on hygiene practices and health outcomes. Northern European populations faced different challenges than Mediterranean populations, with longer winters that made bathing more difficult, but also provided natural refrigeration for food preservation. Wet climates created problems with mold and mildew in clothing and bedding, while dry climates made water scarcity a constant concern. The gradual improvement in living standards during the later medieval period brought some enhancement in hygiene practices, but these improvements were slow and uneven. Better construction techniques led to homes with improved ventilation and drainage. The development of glass windows allowed for better lighting and air circulation. Advances in metalworking produced better tools for personal care and food preparation. However, even these improvements were limited by the fundamental lack of understanding about disease transmission and the continued scarcity of resources for most of the population. People might live in slightly better houses and own slightly better tools, but they still practiced the same basic hygiene habits that had been passed down through generations of trial and error. The persistence of poor hygiene practices, despite their obvious negative consequences, shows how difficult it was for people to change behaviors without understanding the underlying causes of their problems. People knew that poor hygiene was unpleasant and socially unacceptable, but they didn't know how to improve their situations given the resources and knowledge available to them. The legacy of medieval hygiene practices influenced European culture for centuries afterward, with some attitudes and habits persisting well into the modern era. The association of bathing with moral corruption, the belief that dirt provided protection against disease, and the acceptance of body odor as natural all continued to influence behavior long after better alternatives became available. Understanding medieval hygiene helps us appreciate both how far human civilization has progressed in terms of public health and sanitation, and how much our current standards of cleanliness depend on technology, infrastructure, and scientific knowledge that was simply not available to our ancestors. The medieval peasant who went months without bathing wasn't lazy or ignorant. They were doing the best they could with the resources and knowledge available to them in a world where survival itself was never guaranteed. The irony of medieval hygiene is that many of the practices people thought were helping them stay clean were actually making things worse. The use of lead-based cosmetics by wealthy women poisoned them slowly while giving them the pale complexion that was fashionable. The practice of bloodletting to purify the body weakened patients and made them more susceptible to infection. The belief that bathing opened the pores and let in disease kept people dirty, when cleanliness might have saved their lives. Gender differences in hygiene expectations created additional layers of complexity in medieval society. Women were expected to be cleaner than men in some respects, particularly regarding their appearance and clothing, but they also faced greater challenges in maintaining cleanliness due to the nature of women's work and social restrictions. A woman who worked in food preparation was expected to have relatively clean hands, but the same woman might be responsible for emptying chamber pots, caring for sick family members, and handling dead animals. The menstrual cycle presented particular challenges for medieval women, who had limited options for managing their periods. Most women used rags that could be washed and reused, but these were often inadequately cleaned and became sources of infection. Some women used moss, grass, or other natural materials that were available, but these weren't particularly absorbent or sanitary. The social taboos around menstruation meant that women couldn't discuss these issues openly or seek advice from medical professionals. Pregnancy brought additional hygiene challenges, as pregnant women were often advised to avoid bathing or vigorous washing for fear of harming the baby. This meant that women went through pregnancy and childbirth with accumulated dirt and bacteria that increased the risk of infection during delivery. Postpartum care was equally problematic, with new mothers expected to avoid washing for weeks after giving birth. The care of infants and small children was handled with practices that seem shocking by modern standards. Babies were often left in soiled, swaddling clothes for hours or days because changing them frequently was considered unnecessary and potentially harmful. Children weren't bathed regularly, and their hair was often left unwashed for months at a time. Lice infestations in children were so common that they were barely considered a problem worth addressing. Toilet training was handled differently than modern practices, with children often going without any covering on their lower bodies until they were old enough to control their bodily functions. This meant that floors in homes with young children were constantly contaminated with urine and feces, creating unsanitary conditions that affected the entire household. The education of children about hygiene was minimal and often based on superstition rather than practical knowledge. Children might be taught to wash their hands before eating, but they weren't taught why this was important or how to do it effectively. They learned hygiene practices by watching adults, which meant that poor practices were passed down through generations without question or improvement. Adolescence brought new hygiene challenges as young people experienced physical changes they didn't understand. The onset of puberty was often accompanied by increased body odor and skin problems that weren't properly addressed. Young men might start growing facial hair without having access to proper shaving tools or instruction. Young women faced the beginning of menstruation without adequate preparation or resources for managing it hygienically. The transition to adulthood often involved taking on new work responsibilities that created different hygiene challenges. A young man who became an apprentice to a blacksmith would suddenly be exposed to heat, smoke, and metal particles that would permanently change his appearance and smell. A young woman who took on household responsibilities might find herself dealing with waste disposal, food preparation, and child care that required hygiene standards she had never been taught to maintain. Marriage brought hygiene expectations that varied widely depending on social class and local customs. Some couples negotiated hygiene standards as part of their marriage arrangements, with agreements about bathing frequency, clothes changing, and personal cleanliness. Other couples simply accepted that they would both maintain whatever standards were typical for their social class and community. The sharing of beds, clothes, and personal items between married couples created opportunities for the transmission of parasites and diseases. A husband who brought fleas home from his work would soon share them with his wife. A wife who developed a skin infection would likely pass it on to her husband. The lack of understanding about disease transmission meant that couples had no strategies for preventing the spread of infections between partners. Elderly people faced particular hygiene challenges as their physical abilities declined and their access to resources diminished. An older person who could no longer carry water from the well might go without washing for extended periods. Someone with arthritis or other joint problems might be unable to remove their clothes for washing or bathing. The social expectation that elderly people should be cared for by their families meant that their hygiene often depended on the willingness and ability of younger relatives to help them. The treatment of mental illness often involved neglect of hygiene as part of the overall neglect of people who were considered mad or possessed. People with mental health problems might be restrained in ways that made personal care impossible, or they might be left to care for themselves when they lacked the cognitive ability to maintain basic cleanliness. The belief that mental illness was caused by moral failing or supernatural forces meant that the physical needs of mentally ill people were often ignored. Disability presented additional hygiene challenges in a society that had limited understanding of accommodation or adaptive techniques. A person who couldn't use their hands normally might be unable to wash themselves effectively. Someone with mobility problems might be unable to reach latrines or washing facilities. The lack of assistive devices or modified tools meant that people with disabilities often had to choose between maintaining hygiene and maintaining independence. The impact of war on hygiene was devastating and long-lasting. Soldiers in medieval armies lived in conditions that made basic hygiene impossible. They wore the same clothes for months, slept on the ground, and had no access to washing facilities. When they returned home, they brought with them diseases, parasites, and hygiene practices that affected their entire communities. The disruption of normal life during warfare meant that hygiene infrastructure like wells and latrines was often destroyed or contaminated. Refugees and displaced people faced the worst hygiene challenges of all. People fleeing from war, famine, or disease often had to abandon their homes with only the clothes they were wearing. They might spend weeks or months living outdoors, begging for food and shelter, with no opportunity to wash themselves or their belongings. The social stigma attached to beggars and vagrants meant that they were often excluded from communities and had no access to whatever hygiene facilities were available to residents. The seasonal migration of workers created temporary communities with poor hygiene infrastructure. Harvest workers might live in temporary shelters with dozens of other people, sharing inadequate latrine facilities and having no access to clean water for washing. These temporary communities became breeding grounds for disease that spread when workers returned to their permanent homes. The development of urban centres created new hygiene challenges that medieval society was unprepared to handle. Cities concentrated large numbers of people in small areas without adequate infrastructure for waste disposal or clean water distribution. The result was urban environments that were incredibly filthy and disease-ridden, even by medieval standards. People who moved from rural areas to cities often experienced a dramatic decline in their hygiene conditions and health outcomes. The growth of specialized crafts and trades created occupational hygiene problems that weren't well understood. Tanners worked with chemicals and animal products that created persistent odors and skin problems. Dyers used substances that stained their skin and clothes permanently. Miners were exposed to dust and chemicals that caused respiratory problems and skin conditions. The lack of understanding about occupational health meant that workers accepted these problems as inevitable consequences of their trades. The development of long-distance trade brought people from different cultures into contact with each other, sometimes creating hygiene culture clashes. Merchants from Islamic countries, where bathing was more common and highly valued, must have been shocked by the hygiene standards they encountered in medieval Europe. Similarly, European traders visiting Byzantine or Islamic territories would have been exposed to different hygiene practices that they might have adopted or rejected based on their cultural prejudices. The influence of classical texts on medieval hygiene was limited but significant among educated elites. Ancient Roman and Greek writings about bathing and personal care were known to some scholars, but this knowledge didn't translate into widespread changes in behavior. The classical emphasis on physical fitness and cleanliness was seen as pagan and potentially immoral by Christian authorities, limiting its adoption. The gradual development of medical knowledge brought some improvements in hygiene understanding, but these improvements were slow and often contradicted by religious teachings or practical limitations. Physicians might understand that certain practices were healthier, but they couldn't implement these practices without access to resources like clean water, soap, and appropriate facilities. The persistence of certain hygiene beliefs and practices shows how difficult it was for medieval people to change behaviors that were deeply embedded in their culture and daily routines. Even when better alternatives became available, people often continued to follow traditional practices because they were familiar, socially acceptable, and required fewer resources than newer methods. The documentation of medieval hygiene practices in contemporary sources gives us glimpses into how people actually lived, as opposed to how we might imagine they lived based on modern assumptions. Account books show purchases of soap and other hygiene-related items, giving us insight into what people could afford and how often they used these products. Legal records describe disputes over access to washing facilities and waste disposal, showing that these were serious concerns for medieval communities. Personal letters and diaries, when they exist, sometimes mention hygiene practices in passing, giving us rare first-hand accounts of how people actually managed their personal cleanliness. These sources often reveal that people were more aware of hygiene issues than we might expect, but that they were limited by practical constraints rather than ignorance or indifference. The archaeological evidence for medieval hygiene practices comes from excavations of homes, castles, and other sites where we can see the physical remains of washing facilities, waste disposal systems, and personal hygiene tools. This evidence sometimes contradicts written sources and gives us a more complete picture of how people actually lived. Archaeological findings show that some medieval communities had more sophisticated hygiene infrastructure than contemporary written sources would suggest. The evolution of medieval hygiene practices over time shows gradual improvements in some areas and persistent problems in others. The later medieval period saw the development of better soap making techniques, improved construction methods that created more sanitary living conditions, and increased trade that made hygiene-related goods more widely available. However, basic problems like inadequate understanding of disease transmission and limited access to clean water persisted throughout the medieval period. The transition from medieval to early modern hygiene practices was gradual and uneven, with some improvements adopted quickly by wealthy elites, while others took centuries to reach the general population. The development of printing allowed for the wider distribution of medical and practical knowledge about hygiene, but literacy rates were still low, and many people continued to rely on traditional practices passed down through oral tradition. The legacy of medieval hygiene practices influenced European culture well into the modern period, with some attitudes and habits persisting long after better alternatives became available. The fear of bathing, the acceptance of body odor, and the association of cleanliness with moral character all had roots in medieval beliefs and practices that took centuries to overcome completely. Understanding the full scope of medieval hygiene challenges helps us appreciate not only how far we've come in terms of public health and personal cleanliness, but also how much our current standards depend on infrastructure, technology, and scientific knowledge that developed gradually over many centuries. The medieval peasant struggling with lice, dirty clothes, And contaminated water was not fundamentally different from us. They were simply working with the tools and knowledge available to them in a world where basic survival required most of their time and energy.